Well, in 1973, I was a postdoc in molecular biology at Columbia University. And it was a time really of a lot of intense discussion. I had a lot of friends who were postdocs. Subjects came up naturally. And I just happened to come across a copy of the Wistar Symposium that was held in 1966 in Philadelphia. It's a collection of essays about Darwinian theory. And I read Murray Eden's article, a critical article about Darwinian theory, and Marcel Schutzenberger's critical argument about Darwinian theory. And I started talking about it with the other postdoctoral fellows, people who were working in the laboratory at the time. And I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that the arguments, which seemed so very credible, very important, went virtually unanswered among the biologists that I knew, who tended to dismiss the arguments in a way that suggested that they hadn't really understood them, and if they had understood them, were not prepared to respond to them. And that was the beginning of my skepticism about Darwinian theory. When I spent a year in Paris working with Schutzenberger, of course, both of us enriched each other's opinions. Schutzenberger had been a long-standing critic within the French biological establishment of Darwinian theory. And what he had to say reinforced what I had to say, what I had to say reinforced what he had to say. Later I talked with Murray Eden. There were a group of us who were similarly skeptical. I must say in the 70s, in the late 60s and in the 70s, there was a much more intensive degree of opposition to Darwinian theory, a much greater willingness to examine Darwinian orthodoxies. The great counter-reformation took place in the 1980s and the 1990s. So when I started work, or when I started thinking about these issues, Schutzenberger and I wanted to write a book together on this. There was a very relatively liberal attitude among mathematicians, people who were interested, physicists, people who were interested in Darwinian theory, a much greater willingness to wonder whether any of this could possibly be true. So that was roughly my own background, my own approach to it. Well, the claim that all skeptics about Darwinian orthodoxy or Christian fundamentalists stands refuted by me. It's obviously not true. I'm neither Christian nor a fundamentalist. But lots and lots of people are skeptical in the scientific community. I know dozens of mathematicians who scratch their head and say, you guys think this is the way life originated. It's absolutely a preposterous theory. And many, many very significant figures. John von Neumann, one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, just laughed at Darwinian theory. He hooted at it. So it's perfectly absurd. This is a point in a polemical dispute. It's not a reasonable standard of criticism. Opposition to Darwinian theory is, I wouldn't say widespread, but there's a consistent group of people among mathematicians, among physicists, among some very good speculative biologists who simply don't accept it, don't even regard it as a scientific theory in any reasonable sense. It's tough to say because we're not dealing with a theory in any sense in which, say, a physicist would recognize the theory. We're dealing with a collection of anecdotes, a certain point of view, a series of hunches. I would say that the most outstanding, the salient points are, first of all, the fossil record, which is simply mystifying. We can't make much sense of the fossil record. It does not sustain any kind of Darwinian prediction that can be intelligently derived from Darwinian theory, and it doesn't seem to sustain anything else as far as I can see. It's a perfectly mystifying record. That's one obvious point. I'm not talking just about the Cambrian explosion. I'm talking about everything that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the fossil record. Second point, we have never been able in any way theoretically to examine the central Darwinian claim that natural selection and random variation can account for a great deal of complexity. If you look at the history of physics, for example, what did Newton do in the 17th century? He said, well, the planets are being attracted to the sun by a force. It's not any kind of force, it's a inverse square force. And then he went and showed that if you make that assumption, the result will be an orbit that conforms exactly to the observed orbit, say, of the Earth or of Mars. It will be a conic section. And then he proved the converse, that if it's a conic section, the planets must be attracted to a central source by an inverse square law. There is nothing like that in biology, in Darwinian theory. A kind of a canonical demonstration that this mechanism, random variation, natural selection, is adequate to the generation of this level of complexity. From the point of view of the serious sciences, without that kind of a demonstration, one is completely adrift. You have no idea whether the mechanism is adequate for its intended purposes. This is the second point. Third evidential piece of the puzzle. Look, you turn to the serious sciences, you turn to general relativity or quantum mechanics. I can program a computer with the equations of general relativity or with the equations of quantum mechanics, and I can say, all right, what are the consequences? I can actually see the consequences emerge in a simulation. We can't do any of this in biology, and that should prompt any reasonable person to ask, why not? If this is such a simple mechanism, which can easily be programmed on a computer, how come we can't set up a computer and create something of biological-like complexity? How come we cannot see the unfolding of an evolutionary process the way we can see the unfolding of an evolutionary process in physics? This is a very serious question. I've looked at all the genetic algorithms. I'm trying to write a genetic algorithm myself. And the sheer fact is, without a tremendous amount of very special manipulation and ad hoc constraints, the computer is not going to generate anything realistic if it uses Darwinian mechanisms, and it will generate something realistic only if it doesn't use Darwinian mechanisms. This is an important point. 50 years after the computer revolution began, we have a splendid tool for assessing the intelligibility and viability of Darwinian theory. And everything that we know, I think this is the uniform experience of anyone working in genetic algorithms, indicates these mechanisms will not work. They will not work for their intended purposes. And finally, there's the utter absence of laboratory evidence. I mean, random variation, natural selection, we should be able to start manipulating organisms. When we look at dogs, no matter how far back we go, it's dogs. When we look at bacteria, no matter what we do, they stay bugs. They don't change in their fundamental nature. There seems to be some sort of an inherent species limitation, and we have no good explanation for this in terms of Darwinian theory. We should have far more flexibility, far more plasticity under laboratory conditions than we actually do if Darwinian theory or anything like that were correct. What we see in nature, what we see in the laboratory, is very highly bounded variation, cyclic variation, as for example finch beaks in the Galapagos Island. That's about all we see. Small variations. Why is that if Darwinian theory is correct? These are evidentiary points that I think need to be stressed, need to be examined openly, honestly. And they never are, of course. Never are. Look, the stuff about finch beaks is certainly interesting. Let's not confuse ourselves about that. The question is, can it be extrapolated, or does it represent cyclic variation? I can say, here's an account of how the eagle flies. Look, I get up, I jump in the air, I flap my hands a couple of times, and I land a few feet from where I started. Thus the origin of flight. The obvious response is, this is nutty. You can flap your hands as long as you want. You won't fly like an eagle. The argument from extrapolation can work in some circumstances. It fails in other circumstances. Plainly, in the case of a human being who jumps 2 feet in the air and then lands 2 feet from where he started, the argument from extrapolation fails. What persuades you in the case of the Galapagos finch that what seem to be cyclic variations are the start, the commencement of a grand process of speciation? That's a step in the argument that has to be completed. It's not enough to say, well, it's more of the same. It's not more of the same self-evidently. It can easily be bounded variation of exactly the same sort as we see in any species experiment. Now, the contrary may be true. We may be seeing the development of entirely new species. The Galapagos finch starts off as a finch, and within 100 million years there'll be a Galapagos elephant. Could be. But we need a whole lot more by way of evidence than a couple of nutty journalists going down there looking at finch beaks and writing a Pulitzer Prize winning book. A whole lot more of this is to be serious science. I mean, this doesn't even pass the threshold of anecdote. Finch beaks change in size. Yeah, they do. They change in shape too. It seems to be correlated with seasons. It seems to be a regress back toward the mean when the seasons change again. If this is the part of a spectacular evolutionary extrapolation, let's have additional reasons for thinking that. Otherwise, we're not even talking about a scientific hypothesis. The interesting argument about the whale, which is a mammal after all. It belongs to the same group of organisms as a dog, a human being, a chimpanzee, or a tiger. The interesting argument about a whale is that if its origins were land-based originally, then we have some crude way of assessing quantitatively, not qualitatively, but quantitatively, the scope of the project of transformation. The project is very simple. Let's put it in vividly accessible terms. You've got a cow. You want to teach it how to live all of its life in the open ocean, still retaining its air-breathing characteristics. What do you have to do from an engineering point of view to change the cow into a whale? This is crude, but it gives you the essential idea. Now, if the same question were raised with respect to a car, and you ask what would it take to change a car into a submarine, we would understand immediately it would take a great many changes. The project is a massive engineering project of redesign and adaptation. Well, the same question occurs with respect to that proverbial cow. Virtually every feature of the cow has to be changed. It has to be adapted. But since we know that life on Earth and life in the water are fundamentally different enterprises, we have some sense of the number of changes. Anytime a science avoids coming to grips with numbers, it's somehow immersing itself in perhaps an unavoidable, but certainly an unattractive miasma. Here's a chance actually to put some numbers on calculations. We're not talking about genetics. We're talking about simple numbers. The skin has to change completely. It has to become impermeable to water. That's one change. Breathing apparatus has to change. A diving apparatus has to be put in place. Lactation systems have to be designed. The eyes have to be protected. The hearing has to be altered. Salivary organs have to be changed. Feeding mechanisms have to be changed. After all, a cow eats grass, a whale doesn't. As I say, I've tried to do some of these calculations. The calculations are certainly not hard. But they're interesting because I stopped at 50,000. That is morphological changes. And don't forget, these changes are not independent. They're all linked. If you change an organism's visual system, you have to change a great many parts of its cerebellum, its cerebrum, its nervous system. All of these changes are coordinated. So when we're talking about an evolutionary sequence such as this, what's interesting about the cow to whale transition, and I'm just using this as an easily accessible idea. What's interesting about the cow to whale transition is that we can see a different environment is going to impose severe design constraints on a possible evolutionary sequence. How are these constraints met if they're roughly 50,000? If they're 2 million constraints, how are those met? And what does this suggest about what we should see in the fossil record? To my way of thinking, if Darwinian hypotheses are correct, it should suggest an enormous plethora of animals, intermediary between, say, Ambulocetus and the next step. That won't solve all problems. One wants to know what's directing this change, if anything. But at least it will put it in the ballpark of a quantitative estimate, which is hardly ever done.
Well, I wrote about 10 icons of evolution in my book. I could have written about more, but I had to stop somewhere. And the 10 that I wrote about were, first of all, the 1953 Miller-Urey experiment that purported to show that life could have begun spontaneously on the early Earth. And this is still found in most biology textbooks, even though geochemists decades ago decided that the experiment was unrealistic and really doesn't say anything substantial about the origin of life. The second icon was Darwin's tree of life, the branching pattern that would show how all organisms descended from a common ancestor at the root. And this is a theoretical statement, but it's presented in most biology textbooks as though it were a fact. The fossil evidence, for example, does not show this branching tree pattern. When you look at the different major groups of animals, they appear pretty much at the same time, rather than diverging from a common ancestor. The third icon I wrote about was homology in vertebrate limbs. If you look at the bone structure of the human hand or the human arm, you compare that to a whale's flipper or a bird's wing or a bat's wing, there are certain striking similarities in the bone structure. And Darwin considered this to be a result of common descent. But people before Darwin had noticed the same thing, and they called it, they attributed it to a common designer. Well, the truth is, it could be either one. The bone structure itself doesn't tell us. The fourth icon is Haeckel's embryo drawings, which purport to show that vertebrates are very similar as early embryos, and therefore this provides evidence for common ancestry. But in fact, the embryos are not similar, and Haeckel faked the drawings. The fifth icon that I wrote about was Archaeopteryx, a famous fossil of an ancient bird that had a long tail and teeth in its beak like reptiles, and for a long time was thought to be the missing link between reptiles and birds. Biologists no longer think that because there are too many differences between Archaeopteryx and modern birds, but textbooks tend to present it as the missing link anyway. The peppered moth is a famous icon of evolution in which moths supposedly changed color during the Industrial Revolution because dark moths were better camouflaged on soot-darkened tree trunks, and the birds couldn't see them, and so they ate the light moths and left the dark ones. And this is still used in many textbooks as a classic example of natural selection in action, when in fact biologists discovered in the 1980s that peppered moths don't rest on tree trunks in the wild at all, or normally. And so the textbook pictures have all been staged, and the story has serious flaws. Darwin's finches, another icon of evolution, are some species of birds on the Galapagos Islands that are very similar except for the size and shape of their beaks. And it's thought, and it's quite possible, that they evolved from a common ancestor because of having to eat different foods on the different islands. But the actual evidence shows us only that the beaks can change over a matter of years based on climate and diet. But the changes are temporary, they oscillate back and forth, and they don't go anywhere. So as evidence for the origin of species, Darwin's finches really don't work. Another icon of evolution is the four-winged fruit fly. Most fruit flies have two wings, but a series of mutations in a fruit fly can cause it to develop a second set of wings, very normal looking, but in fact there are no muscles attached to it, so the second set of wings is effectively dead. The fly is a hopeless cripple. It's kind of like having a small plane with an extra pair of wings tied to its tail. This is not the forerunner of a new race of insects, but an evolutionary dead end. The last two icons I wrote about were fossil horses and the ape-to-human picture. In both cases, there is some real evidence here.
Well, in 1973, I was a postdoc in molecular biology at Columbia University. And it was a time really of a lot of intense discussion. I had a lot of friends who missed the arguments in a way that suggested that they hadn't really understood them, and if they had understood them, were not prepared to respond to them. And that was the beginning of my skepticism about Darwinian theory. When I spent a year in Paris working with Schutzenberger, of course, both of us enriched each other's opinions. Schutzenberger had been a long-standing critic within the French Darwinian theory, and I started talking about it with the other postdoctoral fellows, people who were working in the laboratory at the time. And I discovered, somewhat to my own surprise, that the arguments, which seemed so very credible, very important, went virtually unanswered among the biologists that I knew, who tended to dismiss postdocs. Subjects came up naturally, and I just happened to come across a copy of the Wistar Symposium that was held in 1966 in Philadelphia. It's a collection of essays about Darwinian theory. And I read Murray Eden's article, a critical article about Darwinian theory, and Marcel Schutzenberger's critical argument about biological establishment of Darwinian theory. And what he had to say reinforced what I had to say, what I had to say reinforced what he had to say. Later I talked with Murray Eden. There were a group of us who were similarly skeptical. I must say in the 70s, in the late 60s and in the 70s, there was a much more intensive degree of opposition